So welcome to everybody. Thank you, Michelle. My name is Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. We will have additional colleagues joining us in the next minutes, but we thought to keep everybody on time, we'd stay as close to the hour as possible. We have a busy day with American Purpose Publishing, and also, if I may say, later today, another Zoom discussion at 5 p.m. with Princeton economic historian Harold James, moderated by Rutgers economic historian Kate Epstein. It's on the history of ideas and language, and it's really good. It's based on a new book Harold James has just published. If you're interested in that, please sign up and join us at 5 p.m. Eastern, and Michelle will put in a link for more information and an opportunity to join that. But now, the matter at hand and our guest of honor, Katherine Katie Zimmerman. Welcome, Katie. Thank you so much for making time. Katie's work is well known to most of you. She's a graduate of Yale. She studied political science and the modern Middle East. She's a prolific writer, researcher, writer. She has testified before Congress. She is in the op-ed pages of places like the Wall Street Journal. You can see her on television, including CNN and so forth. So she's a talent, she's knowledgeable, and she has expertise at the matter at hand. The matter at hand is the following, as I frame it. I think we called this session Finished with the Greater Middle East, Not So Fast. Washington is a funny animal, as many of you know. Our attention span is not always wonderful, and we move from focus to focus. And I thought that at a time when we're all talking about strategic competition with China, which is vitally important. I mean, vitally important. It would be good to make sure we keep a wide lens, that we talk about Katie's area of expertise and look at the greater Middle East, not only, by the way, but the greater Middle East on issues of Islamic terrorism, or I suppose what would be known in Katie's field as the Salafi-jihadi movement and network. So that is my introduction. It's going to be a conversation where I'm going to ask Katie questions for 15 or 20 minutes just to introduce a number of ideas, but this is an experts roundtable, participant intensive. I promise I won't take more than 15, maybe 16, 17 minutes, because we want to open it up to the gallery because there's loads of expertise in the gallery. So with that framing and with that introduction, and thanks to Katie, the first question I would like to ask you, Katie, before we dive into content, is if you would tell us a little bit of how you entered this field as a student at Yale, and then for the last 10 years ago as a researcher at AEI as part of the Critical Threats Project. Can we get a little bit of your background and your motivation in the subject area?
Happy to give it, and thanks again for having me here today. It's really a pleasure. So how did I get into what I do? I will say I've always been enamored of the Middle East, and I had a teacher actually at St. Paul's School, my high school, that introduced me to the world of foreign policy. And that was kind of when I knew what I wanted to be doing, was looking at US foreign policy in the Middle East. And so, you know, if you think about the time that I was going to school, it was a couple of years after 9/11, and all of the Arabists who were working on the Middle East were looking at it from the terrorism lens. And I was adamant that I was not going to end up being another Arabist working on Al-Qaeda. And so at Yale, I focused on comparative politics, particularly looking at the co-option of Islamist parties in the Middle East in democratic governments, or authoritarian but democratic governments. And of course, the efficacy of US foreign assistance. So really looking at the soft power aspects, and graduated right after the recession. So there was not much in terms of employment, and took an internship at the American Enterprise Institute, fell in love with the intellectual effort that Fred Kagan was directing with the Critical Threats Project and putting the puzzle pieces together on this place. Yemen and Somalia was what I first started working on, and I knew nothing about those because in those days, they taught about Yemen in light of the Saudi-Egyptian proxy war. So it's a sentence in history books, unlike today where we get actual full classes looking at the complexity in the country. I really enjoyed the work and happened to be there when the Arab Spring broke out and found myself all of a sudden very young, able to do exactly what I was looking to set out to do and working on some of the aperture of US foreign policy inside of the Middle East. And of course, the obvious is I failed. I have specialized on Al-Qaeda. And so it all comes full circle, right?
Well, there are reasons for these things, where we end up in focus and priorities. So let me ask you a second, somewhat related question before we get into the content. So, and I'm taking this from your own writing, by the way, is it fair to say that for a new generation, and I'm going to say in your peer group, there is diminished interest in this region and some of these issues, perhaps in part because people think, good heavens, this is synonymous with Iraq, invasion, occupation, and you're good to point out in your work that there's really, once we've identified the problem or problems, it's really a multifaceted strategy one needs to tackle the problems. We'll get to that in a minute, but tell us a little bit about Americans in particular in their 20s and 30s and early 40s and how they're hearing, reading, and thinking about this subject matter.
Always being loath to generalize, but just looking at how the Middle East has been portrayed culturally. For my generation, we've grown up looking at the bad guy being an Arab terrorist and the Middle East being at war. And that is something that just really gets reemphasized in Hollywood and even in the media reports, because the news reporting is talking about the events that are happening. And inevitably, it's the terror attacks or the war that's ongoing or reasons why we should be withdrawing from the Middle East. And what has been missed, I think, particularly for some of the younger parts of the generation, post-Arab Spring has been the opportunity to travel the region freely and to fall in love with it the way that so many people who work on the Middle East and North Africa and elsewhere have just really learned to love the people and the culture by being there. It's, I think, something we miss when we talk about the region, but the fact that you can't really study abroad in a lot of the places where we used to due to security threats and the tumult that is still ongoing 10 years later has really restricted, I think, the cultural exchange that was occurring during the 90s and throughout the early 2000s.
So thank you. And then as we move into more of the substance, Katie, you are in my words, a researcher, scholar of Salafi-jihadi networks. Can you start with definition? What should we understand by that? And then go to groups, because if that's a rubric, tucked under that rubric are different groups prevalent and prominent in different areas, maybe working together or maybe in rivalry with one another. Could you give us that frame and context, please?
Certainly. And Salafi jihadism as a concept is very complicated, but the simple terms are Salafism is the type of Sunni Islam that is looking to restore the practice of the day-to-day practice of the religion back to the days of the followers of the Prophet Muhammad, the Salaf. The idea is that mankind has introduced they've modified the religion, and by modifying it to suit our modern day world, have really moved away from what true Islam is. Salafis are conservative. You're going to find Salafis in Saudi Arabia is Wahhabi Salafism is usually equated with conservative Islam, but they are throughout the world. And generally the way to think about them is they really are fundamentalists and devout. They're problematic in the sense that they're looking for an illiberal type of rule, but many of them, I would say, are quietist or working through political channels. The real challenge is when we get to the small minority within this fundamentalist trend that believe that jihad is obligatory upon them to bring about this vision. So it's that marriage of a fundamentalist belief with this religious obligation then to use violence to achieve the aims of that belief that is Salafi jihadism. The ideology itself has been in existence really since the 13th century. The modern day movement came about during the time of the Soviet Afghan war, so the jihad inside of Afghanistan, when it became practiced. And it was never really a mobilizing force within Muslim communities. And I still believe that Salafi jihadism is an extremist view that is going to be within the smallest of minorities. And the challenge is, of course, those who hold that belief have started to network and develop global networks. And this is something that is even more challenging today with this era of globalization and the digital world, where you can actually create a community without having them be in the same place. The other challenge, of course, is that these believers have organized into groups. And this is where I think the question that you really want to get to is, what does it mean to be a Salafi jihadi, and how are they working on the ground? So Al-Qaeda became the dominant group coming out of the Afghan jihad, and of course, all the way up through the declaration of the Islamic State in 2014, at which point the schism within the ideology became readily apparent to outside observers. And what I like to point out is that Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State are rivals within the same ideological movement. They fundamentally believe that the other is pursuing their aims the wrong way. They actually believe the others are going to hell. But what we see is that it's a competition that is actually beneficial for both, because they're able to broadly advance their own objectives by using what the other has accomplished. So this idea that Al-Qaeda, the more, quote, moderate version, will eliminate the Islamic State, and that's fine, it just doesn't hold water, because if Al-Qaeda wins, we still have this massive Salafi jihadi threat, and Al-Qaeda then advancing globally.
So I want to return to the threat in a few moments, also talk about state actors like Iran. But before I do that, Katie, let me ask you about the following. Now, I understand no two countries are the same, and the groups are not identical. You just suggested that some are in conflict and competition with one another. But if you allow, the general question is this: how do they operate and connect with communities on the ground? I know that's been an important part of your research and writing. I'll say parenthetically, I took a group of policy experts, parliamentarians to Egypt a few years ago. We sat in a room with some Egyptian colleagues from scholarship and politics, and one of the Americans, or maybe it was a European, said, how in Egypt do we contain and defeat the Muslim Brotherhood? And the first Egyptian colleague laughed and said, that's the wrong language, because in Egypt, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood owns and operates virtually all the hospitals in the country. They're embedded, they're connected, they've made themselves, they are part of the fabric and community. Tell us a little bit about how these different groups operate in different theaters and what they do. Well, is it the right word, to make themselves more popular, but to embed them and connect them to communities? What do they do? And then we're going to talk about what you recommend that we do in return. But go ahead with that, if you would.
Yeah, I think when we think about the Salafi jihadi movement, the construction in Maoist revolution is actually really helpful here with the idea of a vanguard. So you can think of the ideologues, the Salafi jihadis, as identifying as part of that vanguard. They understand true Islam and they are trying to change the world. Of course, if you kind of understand that, you realize that you actually can't make the ideology itself a mass ideology, because inevitably, by having more people believe in it, you distill it and destroy it. So what they're trying to do is have this vanguard advancing Islam and generate the popular support. And there's a clear difference between, I'll say, Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State in terms of how they believe they should be advancing that popular support and creating the movement behind Salafi jihadism. Starting with Al-Qaeda, because that's the one that's been around longest. Al-Qaeda first thought that it could simply inspire people to join and support it, because there's this idea that once you understand Islam, you'll naturally lend yourself to this ideology, which has, of course, proven false many times over. And Al-Qaeda learned in the early 1990s that its approach, right, this very fundamentalist idea of Islam, the deaths of civilians, especially in Algeria and in Egypt, created a gap between those who believed in it and the community that they were trying to work within. And so when you look at what Al-Qaeda leaders have talked about over the years, it really is this idea that they cannot be isolated from the masses, that you cannot actually pursue ideological objectives if you aren't able to work within the community that you're trying to impact. And so Al-Qaeda has gone about adapting to that problem in various ways. The Arab Spring helped it enormously. It's necessary to say, of course, the events after the Arab Spring were exogenous to Al-Qaeda and the Salafi-jihadi movement, but they capitalized on the breakdown of security, governance, and the degradation, I would say, of the resilience of certain communities to their encroaches. And what these groups have done is primarily deliver defense to communities that are under attack. So broadly looking at the Syrian case, Salafi jihadis, Al-Qaeda under the name of Jabhat al-Nusra, and there's a hodgepodge there now today, have sought to defend the opposition against very brutal Assad regime attacks. And they're willing to go anywhere and fight anywhere and die, which has made them immensely popular as defenders of Muslim. It's probably the most powerful way that these groups have been able to do it. They've done a similar thing inside of the Sahel, inside of Mali, in intra-identity conflict inside of Mali. The other ways that this group has really gained strength has been delivering mediation and justice, so dispute resolution. They are fundamentalist. They are not corrupt, and that means that their judgments are inherently fair, if extreme. And I'll just point everyone to, I think, some commentary, and I believe it was the New York Times this weekend on Somalia. Just, we still have Somalis going to Shabaab courts, not because they want Shabaab governance, but because the Somali courts are so corrupt. They're looking for fair judgments on their land disputes. And you enter into a mediation knowing that you'll accept the results. The groups also just deliver back ends of governance. So if there's fuel shortages, water shortages, food shortages, the groups will try and bring that to the population and buy entry into the community by providing something like that, something tangible, or education, for example. And then that gives them access to the terrain that the community is on, and of course, presence within the community, which gives them the opportunity to continue to preach. Dawah, so proselytization, is a key form of how Al-Qaeda pushes its message. So preaching and charity, and then in the hopes of identifying the few other recruits within that community to fill the ranks. So that's how Al-Qaeda has built its support. It's also in places where it's been for years. In Yemen, for example, it's intermarried into tribes, which makes it very difficult then to say, this individual is an Al-Qaeda member and a terrorist, and this individual is a tribesman. It's really mixing and interweaving into the social fabric. If we just break there and switch to the Islamic State believes actually that once you understand Islam, you need to enforce Sharia as it is delivered by Allah. So in this very fundamentalist interpretation. So the way that Al-Qaeda maneuvers and the space that Al-Qaeda gives for communities to slowly adopt this more conservative form of Islam, the Islamic State believes is wrong. And so the Islamic State will move into communities and really use methods of coercion and co-optation. We'll see, tactics such as degrading the community elders and the other kind of primary leaders of the community, including the media, before the Islamic State moves in, basically degrading the ability of the community to resist the Islamic State. The Islamic State will come in, declare itself there, and then use force to ensure that the members support it. So it's a very different strategy. The end result is, of course, as we see, the Islamic State is able to generate an Islamic society much faster, but the community is very ready to reject the Islamic State when given the opportunity. When Al-Qaeda moves in, because Al-Qaeda has mingled in and really latched on to local insurgencies and local issues, it's much more complicated to unwind Al-Qaeda and that network from the actual community itself.
Thank you. I have a penultimate final question, then we open it up. The penultimate from my side right now, colleagues and Katie, is this. When you're offering testimony, speaking to members of Congress, and a member of Congress says to you, this is very interesting, but isn't it mostly troubling, local, and unlikely to strike the American homeland? Don't we have other priorities? China, China, China. How do you respond and how do you manage that sort of conversation? The fact of the matter is, yes, we do have China on our plate. We have competition with Russia as well and other maligned actors. And I would say other actors that are nominally partners, but their activities are competitive with American interests. So some of our Gulf state partners, for example. And when we're looking at this problem set, we want to define it simply as counterterrorism. And that's actually where my work is pushing back. If we define Al-Qaeda because of the tactic that it has adopted, that prescribes a set of policy options, and they're the ones that we're all familiar with, right? The drone strikes, targeting the network, enforcing border security, and really trying to prevent individuals from radicalizing and joining the group. The idea being that we can eliminate the network by whittling it down to the few believers and preventing others from joining. But when we understand how they operate on the ground, it's really the terrorism aspect isn't present. And it's that mixing into the local issues that really becomes salient. And over time, it gives these groups access to more terrain, more space, more capabilities, and they are doing it out of the watch of the United States. And so as much as I want to say that the US could have the resources to watch all of this all the time, the fact of the matter is the ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities that we need to understand what's going on, the ability to have a human network on the ground to collect intelligence. We don't have that global presence. We're strapped for resources as it stands, even as the Salafi-jihadi movement has expanded beyond where it was in 2001, which was actually quite concentrated into newer places in Africa and embedding itself in Syria. So how do we deal with that with the China question? The bifurcation between competition and counterterrorism is a false one. And it's one where I think if we really look to do more than just counterterrorism to counter these groups, where we look to actually compete with them on the ground, prevent them, and target the means by which they're entering the communities, and really break down that relationship that they've been able to build primarily through soft power means, so foreign assistance and looking at some of the local politics, we can actually assert our own interests. And in the process, it starts to kind of ensure that the US sphere of influence is there, vice China or Russia. And so a little bit of it is understanding, one, that we actually should be maintaining a presence supporting these counterterrorism operations, because that presence yields relationships, it yields influence in a lot of these spaces. And at the end of the day, it is our interest. Whereas if we define all of our foreign policy and foreign relations based on this geostrategic competition,
We're just set in a realm of reacting to other actors rather than advancing our own interests.
So thank you. My final question before we open it up is about Iran. We read a lot about the nuclear file. We hear about Iran, state sponsor of terrorism, but I don't know if we dig deep enough in the public discourse and mainstream media. You research this. Tell us how and why Iran is important.
Iran is important for the reasons that you lay out. The nuclear threat is very real. And the expansion of Iranian influence, particularly in the Middle East, has had negative effects in terms of stability. Just looking at the partners that Iran chooses to back, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and the opposition groups inside of Bahrain, all of them really lend themselves to terrorist activities and to using I think, advancing Iranian interests through a more radical means. Particularly, I think the Iranians unintentionally drive sectarianism, which, of course, benefits the Iranians, but it also benefits Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State by creating these sectarian tensions that both sides are able to use. And if it radicalizes the region in a very dangerous way, as it's destabilizing. And an interesting aspect that I think often gets missed as we separate, right, the Al-Qaeda and Islamic State threat from the threat of Hezbollah and the Al-Houthis and the Iraqi Shia proxy militia groups, is the ability to share the innovations. And so, just looking at the use of UAVs, drones on the battlefield, right? The Islamic State was one of the first non-state actors to start using drones in a regular fashion inside of Iraq and Syria. They were using them for surveillance. They also began putting shrapnel on them and creating, airborne bombs with the drones. We saw the Houthis start to use that inside of Yemen. And then Iran, of course, has been driving some of the technological innovation on that front. And it's interesting to watch tactics that the Houthis have tested inside of Yemen now appearing inside of Iraq, being used by Iraqi Shia militias. So we can actually see the vector of threats moving in and around where the Quds Force has been operating. Jeff, you're on mute.
I said, thank you. That's a spectacular overview. How about that? And let's get people in. I'm just gonna, it won't be in any proper order. I'm seeing a number of things. Let me come to Patrick Chamarel first, and then the question in chat second. And Rebecca, my colleague, when I miss one, tell me. Patrick, you have the floor. And in each case, introduce yourself, please.
Thank you, Jeff. Yes, I'm Patrick Chamarel. I teach at Stanford, and I'm very interested in the kind of issues you're raising, Kathy, and thank you very much for your overview. I'd like to ask you actually two questions. One is about the connection between the Muslim Brotherhood that Jeff mentioned, and you told that anecdote about the Egyptian hospitals that are controlled by the Muslim Brotherhood, and you cannot really get rid of them. But what is the connection between the Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda and ISIS? I mean, and the terrorist organizations. So that's my first question. The second is, well, you've described, and we all know that, the Islamist ideology is it's a terrible one. I mean, it's a totalitarian ideology and recognized as such, of course, by scholars like you and, through what they do and in the Middle East, especially, and as you said, in more and more regions in the world. So they seem to be making inroads. But how come that the US recognizes that the ideology almost everywhere, but in Europe, that there is, if I read the, the press that you read also, probably there is a kind of, minimizing the risk and the poison of of that ideology as it has started to spread, it's spreading more and more within Europe and Western Europe. I mean, so what do you think it is? I mean, is that a reflection on, on foreign policy, that it's not that important and we are going to try to minimize the risk, or is it just that for most Americans, like they see Islamophobia as being even a greater risk than radical Islamism?
Let me actually start with your second question. And I think, when you're looking at the risk in Europe, and right, it's true that, right, we can look at the UK as a great example of radical Islam and the challenges with the platforms that actually some very extremist viewpoints receive in the UK. I think it's the reaction to the radical ideology is downplayed. One, because they're sovereign nations, so it's their issue. But two, I do believe that it does come down to this idea of, as so long as they're not using violence, and I'll circle back to this when we're talking about the Muslim Brotherhood, we shouldn't interfere in what they're saying. And from an American perspective, that First Amendment idea, right, freedom of speech and belief is crucial, and it's a question of when you cross it. So when can you take action when somebody starts providing, quote, material support to terrorist organizations and networks that we can do it. I think the European reactions are all different to it, and the real challenge is actually the Islamic State has had it as somewhat of a campaign over the past 5 to 6 years to drive Islamophobia, so to drive an overreaction to Islam in order to really create tensions among communities. And we can see this sometimes between some of the refugee communities and the host nation, where there's lack of integration and they are defined as the other. And so I really think that when it comes to dealing with the problem of radicalization in Europe, what really needs to happen is a discussion about what's acceptable in terms of what the ideology is and is not, whether we are looking at mosques or preachers who are fundamentally serving to recruit and vet individuals and moving them along a radicalization pipeline, at which point the government should be intervening and perhaps making sure that those radical views aren't given the types of exposure that they have been, but also ensuring that the populations don't simply blame all Muslims for this problem that is a minority. And it's something, we can see rising, the anti-Muslim sentiments as well, since the arrival of the Islamic State, which is kind of driving off of itself. Saying all of that, I want to talk about the Muslim Brotherhood, because it is, right, it's the bigger problem in the Middle East and elsewhere. And the fascinating thing about the Muslim Brotherhood and particularly Al-Qaeda is that they disavow each other, because the Muslim Brotherhood has sworn off generally violence. There's a trend now post-coup in Egypt to use what they're calling kind of limited violence on the street, which is they're trying to differentiate between that and the terrorist attacks in Egypt in the early 1990s. But the Muslim Brotherhood's idea fundamentally is to use the kind of political methods in order to gain power. And every single time we've seen the Muslim Brotherhood or a like-minded political party gain power by that means, we actually see it lose power pretty rapidly, because yes, they are the best organized. Yes, they have the most influence within the population because they are connected to the hospitals, because they're providing, meals and charity and helping communities are actually on the ground. But at the end of the day, people do not want to live under that type of government. So you can see it in Egypt with the coup, right? There was barely a reaction when a democratically elected member of the Muslim Brotherhood was thrown out. It was actually support for the coup. And you can see it in Tunisia as well, where the Muslim Brotherhood came into power after the Arab Spring. There was a lot of fear about what was going to happen in Tunisia. And over time, Ennahda, that political party, has had to moderate, has had to make compromises, and really has been brought in, has part of it has been mainstreamed, and those that aren't willing to be mainstreamed have been pushed, really to the fringes and are not as powerful anymore, which to me is a tell that this ideology is not something that is inevitable within the Muslim world, that most Muslims are going to reject it, and that giving it the political space to lose is a way to actually ensure that people are properly represented, they're allowed to believe in it, so long as they restrict their methods to political means. The real challenge is, of course, when you look at Al-Qaeda, many of the members of Al-Qaeda were former Muslim Brotherhood members. They radicalized after having joined the Muslim Brotherhood, after having seen the failure to achieve the objectives politically, and then they turned to violence. And so, if you're looking at it from that perspective, yes, it's a gateway to a very dangerous ideology and this idea of the obligation of the use of force. And I think when we're looking at the means to prevent that, it's hyper tactical, but identifying the individuals that are helping to feed those recruits into the Salafi-jihadi network, because they're fundamentally providing support to a terrorist organization. Same thing with the financing. Certainly there are individuals who aren't actual members of Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, but they give a lot of money because they believe in the ideas. And so, what I would call for is, a much more intensive look at that political gray space, and really going after the individuals and the networks that are not actually members of the terrorist organizations, but that are allowing the terrorist organizations to function by giving them some of the necessary things like recruits and money.
Thank you.
So thank you, and thank you, Patrick. Before I go to Miriam and then Giselle, could I ask my colleague, Rebecca, if when you have a moment, could you put in chat, Rebecca, some of Katie's work? And I would say, in particular, a 2019 report titled Beyond Counterterrorism, Defeating the Salafi-jihadi Movement, but so that people have a little bit of a way to get to that sort of work quickly, accessibly. Thank you, Rebecca. So Miriam, you have the floor.
Okay, so I guess first off, Katie, I read your article, The Beyond Counterterrorism.
Miriam, sorry to interrupt. Miriam, sorry to interrupt. Introduce yourself. I'll ask the same thing with Giselle, and then please.
Hi, I'm Miriam Reichman. I am not an expert like the rest of you guys. I'm pretty new to any of this field. I'm a recent Brandeis graduate. Last fall, I took a course with Professor Jutta Clausen, she does mapping of terrorist networks and has a number of articles about the global jihad movement. And in that class, we read Katie's Beyond Counterterrorism article, which was honestly one of my favorite of the whole semester, because it just really gave such insight. So that's who I am, and that's my relation to this. And so my question was, I guess, to Katie is, do you think the difference between ISIS and Al-Qaeda's methodology of embedding themselves in the community, like the coercive versus not coercive, the more like the immediate versus the more gradual, correlates to who they define as the main enemy? Being that ISIS, it focuses on the near enemy, it focuses on the corrupt, the apostate governments, it focuses on the corrupt, like the Muslims that they believe are not really, in doing Tawheed how they should be, versus Al-Qaeda, who recognizes the far enemy as the main enemy, like the United States being the head of the snake, and they come after that. So they're willing to let those apostate governments stay in place as long as they're going after the far enemy. So I was wondering if that's a correlation.
I think it correlates. I don't think it's causation. And so when we're understanding how the two groups, Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, have prioritized their fights, right? You rightly put, right? Al-Qaeda is very focused on going after the far enemy, basically the Western states, primarily the United States, that is backing the apostate regimes inside of the Muslim majority world. And what has happened over time is when Al-Qaeda initially came into being, so in the early 1990s, the idea was that the Arab Afghans and the various Salafi-jihadi groups that were gaining support from bin Laden's group, that they would be able to overthrow the regimes inside of North Africa in particular, but in other places throughout the world, and they failed. And that failure meant to bin Laden, Algeria and Egypt being, again, key pieces here, where Western states came in and prevented the local movements from succeeding. And so what bin Laden decided was that it was actually the imposition of the United States in propping up these very weak apostate regimes that have enabled them to survive and will enable them to repress any revolutionary movement. So the idea was to kind of make sure that the US was out of the Middle East, out of the Muslim majority world, and then these weak governments are there for the taking. And so, we do see the prioritization on terror attacks primarily as the means to remove the United States and French influence from the Middle East and North Africa. But we still see actually Al-Qaeda working very diligently within communities to build support, not very successfully, but certainly operating over time. What the Islamic State sees is, rather than kind of having this very long-term strategy of getting the US out and then fighting the state, that it's actually obligatory to not make any compromises. So any acceptance of an apostate within your immediate striking zone is seen to be heretical. And when we look at how the Islamic State has defined its enemies, it doesn't define them as the enemy of today and the one of tomorrow. So kind of this Al-Qaeda wink and nod that happened with the Iranian regime in the 1990s and into the 2000s. But rather the Islamic State saying anyone who does not believe in this today is our enemy. And really taking a tech theory point of view. So tekfirism is this idea of labeling other Muslims as apostates and going after them. And when we watch as the Islamic State develops, it too actually focused on the far war, and that kind of gets forgotten because of the drama and the kind of, I would say, brutal theater that happened inside of Iraq and Syria. Theater here meaning the dramatic of it, where we have the videos coming up and kind of these horrific executions of various individuals who have created some sort of crime against the Islamic State. They were running networks into Europe in order to start attacking the Europeans. They were looking to foment kind of an intra-identity war inside of Europe. And one of the campaigns that the Islamic State talks about is one that is to eliminate the gray zone, that you cannot be a Muslim living in Europe and deciding not to take a side between the, quote, Europeans, if you will, and the Muslims. What the Islamic State was doing was simply phasing that in over time. The criticism, of course, by each is that Al-Qaeda has taken too long to do anything. It actually doesn't have anything to show for it. It never quite got beyond this idea of terrorism, and it stagnated. And then the US has led a fairly successful counterterrorism campaign. And so, right, Al-Qaeda has been neutered. Whereas, the criticism of the Islamic State is it went so hard and so fast that it alienated so many of the people. It actually managed to cohere, something we don't talk about anymore today, but it brought Arab states together to unite and militarily act against the Islamic State, which Al-Qaeda really hadn't been able to do because the Islamic State was so heretical. We actually saw a better mobilization within the Muslim world against the Islamic State than we've seen against Al-Qaeda, just because it is so fundamentally extreme and threatening.
Do you think that's changed now that with Afghanistan? Do you think Al-Qaeda sees that as like, you know, a win in their like, you know, their long plan for the future? They're like, hey, look, our thing works, our ideology works.
Certainly. And, you know, the Al-Qaeda network has been trumpeting the Afghanistan win since the Taliban took over. And just, you know, a little point of refinement is that the Taliban follows a Deobandi ideology, which is not quite the same as what Al-Qaeda has, but they are really hand in glove in terms of their relationship and the way that they see their aims. So yes, what Afghanistan has done is create now again a place on earth where Islam is practiced and governed in its proper form, with only the Islamic State really saying that that's not Islam. And we'll actually see what the Islamic State in Khorasan is able to do. It's unlikely to be able to kind of succeed in the long-term fashion, but there are a lot of cleavages within the Afghan society that the Islamic State is going after. So the ethnic identities, so the Taliban are primarily Pashtun, and you know they've been moving against the Hazara, for example, and of course the Hazara tend to be Shia, so you have a sectarian identity there as well that's being targeted. But you know when we look at how Afghanistan has affected the way that the Al-Qaeda network is talking about, it's that the path of jihad works. Stay true to the methodology that the Taliban and other Al-Qaeda organizations have been using for years, and eventually you will be able to defeat, you know, the big bad United States and take over.
So thank you, Miriam, and thank you, Katie. You all, we've got 10 minutes left, and I want to get in Giselle Donnelly and Professor Callaway, and we'll see where we are. But Giselle, you have the floor, and please introduce yourself.
Well, I'm Giselle Donnelly. I've worked very closely with Katie at AEI for ever since she came there, and I've been reading her work and stealing her ideas every day since the day she was there. But I have two related questions for Katie. One, where do you think the jostling among the Salafi-jihadi groups is in relation to who's best positioned to set themselves as sort of the champions of Sunni Islam along in the sort of region-wide contest between the Gulf states and the Sunni peoples of that region and Iran. So we don't need to focus principally on the Arab Peninsula and the Gulf area, but I'll leave it to you. And secondly, to return to the title of the talk, yeah, we do think we're at least we in the United States think we're done with the Middle East. Certainly our last three presidents have worked really hard to do that.
Zoom, and I was asking a question about Muslim. Yeah.
Okay, and
I'm not sure what happened. Go ahead, Giselle.
Yeah, no, it's that vicious unmute button, that disruptive little thing. And Katie, if you could sort of like, you know, look through your crystal ball and forecast either, you know, if we do stay out for a number of years, 5 years or something like that, what does that look like? We always think it can't get worse, and then it does. Or conversely, can you imagine something that would cause us to change our mind? So sorry for the long diatribe, but.
So Giselle, thank you. And it wasn't a diatribe at all. It was great to put those things on the table. Katie, if I may, with 8 minutes and a hard stop at 1 p.m. Eastern, let me go ahead. Howard, if you're still there, Professor Callaway, let's get you into the conversation, and then we will invite Katie to reply to both of you. Howard, are you there? Then there's a question or two in chat from Professor Callaway. Katie, you have the floor.
Okay, let me just read this briefly. To get after Giselle's questions, I've benefited as well from her work significantly. And since I can talk about the enemy, and then I look to Giselle to understand what we can do about it. So when we're looking at the future of Islam in the Middle East, and right, who's going to remain dominant, and what is the culture going to be, I think it's a big question today. I talked about the increase of Iranian influence, and we're seeing Shiism in the Middle East increasingly tied to Iran as a supporter of the Shia broadly, which has been an objective for the Iranian regime for decades now. And the reaction to that, of course, has been from the Gulf states in particular, but they are looking primarily to prevent, I think, the Iranian political, the political spread of Iranian influence rather than the religion, since it's very actually rare to see Sunni and Shia convert. But there is a massive question within Sunni Islam as to kind of what the dominant power center is going to be. And Saudi Arabia has been weakened significantly over time in terms of that center. Wahhabi Islam, which is a core pillar of the Saudi regime and the strength of the monarchy, is not palatable to many Sunnis. It's too conservative, too fundamentalist. And the reforms that Saudi Arabia has been going through over the past really 5-6 years in particular, but this kind of Vision 2030 that the Crown Prince has put forward in removing some of the restrictions, allowing women to drive, building outdoor theaters, allowing music, and some of the kind of more extreme points of views, and opening up the kingdom, hasn't brought down Saudi Arabia yet. But it's still not the Islam, I think, that most Muslims live by. The other side of this is Al-Azhar University in Egypt, which had been a source of strength for Sunni Islam, has really had challenges since the Arab Spring. It became co-opted by the Muslim Brotherhood and associated with that brand of Islam. And now it's under much tighter state control, which really removes its legitimacy in terms of what Sunni Islam is. And the other challenge, of course, has been the training of the everyday imams and clerics who are talking about what Sunni Islam is and where do they go. And I think it's one of the real challenges in Sunnism in particular, very different from Shiism, because it's up to the individual to choose an imam to follow, and the imam, there's not kind of a hierarchy of imams, and it's fundamentally kind of where's the money is the most predominant form. I think Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, aren't going to gain traction for similar reasons to the for similar reasons to the Muslim Brotherhood. But still, when we're looking at the role of Islam in state and society, that has actually driven conflicts to date in the Middle East. That drove the part of the Qatar crisis, where the Gulf states implemented a blockade on Qatar, which has apparently been resolved, but I would say probably hasn't been. It's just being glossed over because of Iran again rising as a problem. And the question of the role of Islam in politics. So can the Muslim Brotherhood play a role in defining what happens with government? I think we need to watch developments carefully and also recognize that the extremist viewpoints tend to be the loudest, but not the most popular. And so I think the question of Sunni Islam is going to be separating the belief in the religion from the politics of the day, and the power dynamics that are ongoing. The key places where we see strong Sunni Islam practice that's not fundamentalist, Jordan, most of Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, et cetera, they're still functioning well. And I think it's under conflict that we see the extreme radicalization occurring, because people cleave to beliefs, and the actors that have strength, and those tend in these days to be the extremists. The second question, which I'm now forgetting from Giselle, it's, I think, what happens when we leave the Middle East, if we leave the Middle East. I think that ties into this question in the chat thread about, the nation building question in the Middle East. So if the US really is able to finally pivot all the way to Asia, rather than turning around in circles and getting drawn back into the Middle East, what does the Middle East look like? We have partners on the ground, and we have been using those partners. The point that I and many others have been making, particularly over the past, I would say 7-8 years, has been those partners are pursuing their own interests, and in so doing are creating challenges in and of themselves. The involvement of Saudi Arabia in the war in Yemen is a key example of what happens when we just say, over to you. And I think it's the lack of strategic guidance from the United States, the unwillingness to even be involved in what's seen as a local conflict and meddling in local affairs has really taken a conflict in Yemen that was an internal domestic political conflict over the distribution of power resources in a country that just went through a revolution and has both regionalized it and I would say internationalized it to some degree, as we're looking at now the extent of the network on both sides or all sides of the conflict inside of Yemen. It makes it much harder to solve the initial problem in the country with the outside actors. So, I think, as the US is leaving, we're watching other adversaries moving in. Russia has moved into the Middle East in a way that hasn't been present during my lifetime. The Russian interests are aligning primarily with Iran, and it's starting to reshape the power dynamics in a way that's going to drive conflicts with the partners that are more natural for the United States. So I would say, if the US simply were to leave, we're going to look at a region that's going to remain embroiled in conflict, and it's going to harm American interests. Yes, there's the oil, but there are also other reasons to be looking at it. It's going to be the basing of our competitors in a way that's denying access to the US and our allies in the Eastern Mediterranean, and actually probably in the Southern Mediterranean in the not too near future if we were to abandon it. It's going to be, I look at the Suez Canal crisis that happened, and that's an obvious example of what could happen in the near future. The Houthis in Yemen are able to project force from and contest the Red Sea, and there's a lot of maritime insecurity now that's hitting a major commercial traffic way. So if we're worried, right, about the shipping crisis today and the idea that our goods are getting to be more expensive, the shells are going bare, we could be looking at that in an extreme form should the Suez shut down due to conflict. And these are things that I don't think we really think about when we think about the Middle East. We tend to think about the actual local issues and the conflicts and the wars that really the US has some interest in, but we don't inevitably do. The Middle East is important to the US because of its geostrategic position. We can't simply abandon it. And then to look at the question in the chat about the idea of nation building and the military involvement, I think this is where some of my points about how we understand our enemies in Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State come to play. We have tried for 2 decades now to defeat them militarily, and we have in many cases. But the problem is that if we do not set the conditions, the proper political conditions, these groups are able to combat. And it really means that we need to have a civilian-led strategy with the military in support of it. Something that has been a talking point, both for myself and various administrations within the US government, I would say since the Bush administration, and it has yet to happen. A lot of this has to come with one, reframing the fight away from just counterterrorism to actually combating the groups on the ground and recognizing the connection between the hyperlocal and their global objectives, but also ensuring that our State Department, has a strategy that it can implement in the region, and a strategy that's not, a long-term one, but what are we trying to achieve in the short and the medium term, and how are we trying to achieve it? That it's resourced, and that there is actual interagency cooperation. So looking to the White House really to pull together the initiatives there. And I think we've seen with the Afghanistan withdrawal some of the failures in interagency cooperation coming through right now.
So Giselle and Katie, thank you very much. We're just a little bit over time and we could have gone another hour or two. I've been taking notes. I have 4 pages filled with notes. At one point, Katie, I was writing down the words, extremists, the loudest voices are not necessarily the most popular. And I thought to myself, good heavens, she shifted to US domestic politics. How did I miss that? This was a terrific conversation. Thank all of you for participating and contributing. I found this informationally rich and analytically fascinating. So we'll all keep reading you, Katherine, Katie Zimmerman, and watching you and listening to you in podcasts. And good luck. It's such important work. And please come back, join us in 2022, give us an update on your work, travels, and research. But all of you, thanks for your valuable time, and especially Katie, what a wonderful hour spent. Brilliant presentation. Thank you so much.